Hey everybody, so this video is going to be about priming effects, more specifically prime to behavior effects. So when we're talking about priming, generally what we're talking about is really any instance in which exposure to some piece of information increases the accessibility of information in our own memories. So, when I say exposure to, something that increases the accessibility, I mean, it could be as simple as, your friend talking about their parents, and suddenly you think about the thoughts of your parents are more easily remembered. You could be watching, you could see a YouTube ad for a YouTube ad for, a Deadpool movie, and suddenly, all your knowledge about superhero movies becomes easily retrievable from memory. All right, that's what I mean when we talk about something, a priming effect. So the temporary increase in the accessibility of information in memory. So accessibility is simply how easily you can access it, or how easily you can think of it. All right, so a priming effect is simply when something increases the ease of retrieval, I guess you could say, or again, accessibility of information in memory. Now, these priming effects, this increase in accessibility, can affect our behavior, and when it does, we have what's called a prime to behavior effect. Now, part of the reason we have priming effects in general is because of something called the spreading of activation. So in memory, most of our memory is largely associative in nature, meaning that when we learn something, we learn the associations between things. For example, even when you're learning language, you're learning transition probabilities. So you're learning the likelihood that two sounds will co-occur. So when you hear the word occur, all right, so you have several sounds there, all right, and so when you learn the word occur, you learn the likelihood of the sound the sound k, and the sound occurring. So occur. All right, I guess there's a fourth sound, the sound in there, but it's essentially you're learning the transition probabilities between those sounds. You're learning the association between those sounds, and most memory works that way. It's associative in nature. So because of its associative in nature, we have these categories in memory, which are little, you can think of them as kind of little webs of related information that's all associated. So when you encounter some piece of information in your everyday life, it activates your memory of that thing that you're encountering. All right, so let's say you see these really cool Sharpie pens. Okay, when you see Sharpie, all right, you see the name brand, and your memory of the name brand is associated with various other memories. Times you've used Sharpies, what you use Sharpies for, etc. Now, when you are exposed to the piece of information about Sharpie, it makes other closely associated information also more easily accessible. So if I just say the word Sharpie, you can probably think back and fairly easily think of the last time you really remember using a Sharpie. All right, so maybe you were making signs for something, I don't know, a garage sale or something. But that memory is going to be more easily retrievable. You're going to have an easier time remembering that if I mention Sharpie than had I not mentioned Sharpie. All right. Now that happens because of this phenomenon called spreading of activation. So when I say Sharpie, all right, it activates your memory of the name of the brand and the product Sharpie. Okay. Now the activation of that memory spreads and activates other related or associated memories. That's a spread. So the activation of the concept that I activated, Sharpie, spreads to other related concepts. So those memories of when you last used a Sharpie, then the memories of what you used them for. All right, those become easier to remember as well, and that's spreading of activation. And all priming effects, or most priming effects, work largely because of this mechanism, this spreading of activation phenomenon. Now, when we talk about primed behavior effects, we're talking about when somebody introduces you to a concept, usually kind of a topic or a trait, all right? We expose you to that, and that activates your mental representation, your memory of that concept. So let's say that I wanted to prime you with competition. Okay, let's say I wanted to prime you with competition. Well, I could subtly show you things that made you think of competition. So, for example, in one study by Kay and colleagues, all they did was keep a briefcase in the room. All right, that's all they did. And simply seeing that briefcase made people think of the business-like atmosphere, which includes competition. All right, so that simply seeing that thing that is associated with competition activates the general idea, your memory, your category of competition. All right. Now, when that happens, it can lead you to become more competitive. And if that happens, we have a prime to behavior effect. But we have a specific kind of prime to behavior effect. In fact, there are two kinds of prime to behavior effects. The first type, assimilation. An assimilation effect. So if you have an assimilation prime to behavior effect, then what happens is when I prime you with competition by showing you that briefcase, you're going to behave more competitively. So you may not, in fact, if you are aware of the prime, so if you're aware of the briefcase and how it might affect you, priming effects typically don't work. So priming effects usually rely on you not being aware of how something might change your behavior. So if in order for a briefcase to make you act more competitively, in order for a briefcase to have an assimilative or assimilation priming effect, you would need to not be aware that a briefcase might make you more competitive. So if I show you a briefcase, you don't think anything about it consciously, and you see this briefcase, it automatically activates this idea of competition, and then I sit you down into a situation where you can be competitive. So a game, so you're playing with somebody else. If I've put a briefcase in the room and you're not aware of that briefcase having any effect on you, then it activates your memory of briefcases. The activation of that memory spreads to other related concepts, such as competition. That competition spreads to the activation of that category of competition spreads to other categories, such as acting competitive, and that increases the chances that you will be competitive. So the spreading activation mechanism leads you from seeing something that reminds you of competition to making you behave more competitively. That's an assimilation priming effect. So a simple definition of an assimilation priming effect is one in which you behave in a way that corresponds or is consistent with the implications of the prime. So if I tried to prime you with competition and you became more competitive, that's an assimilation priming effect. Now, as I said, there are two types of priming effects. We've already talked about assimilation. A second is a contrast effect. Now, a contrast priming effect works on a whole different mechanism. So remember that an assimilation priming effect works on the mechanism of spreading of activation. You see something, it activates a memory, the activation of that memory spreads to other related concepts, and those other concepts can influence your behavior. With a contrast priming effect, what happens is you're introduced to an idea. That idea is so very blatantly not you, and so you compare yourself to it. So, for example, in one study, they primed people with the idea of Albert Einstein. Now, most of us think of Albert Einstein as this just ridiculously smart person. Well, most of us think we're smart, but we don't think we're that smart. So when we when we get exposed to these kinds of targets, which are called extreme exemplars, so Einstein would be an extreme exemplar of intelligence. So exemplar is just kind of like a specific instance of a concept. So an exemplar of intelligence would be Einstein. An exemplar of athleticism might be Michael Jordan. An exemplar of wealth might be Warren Buffett. Something. So an exemplar is just a specific instance. Now you can have extreme exemplars, and all the exemplars I just gave are extreme exemplars. Einstein was extremely smart, Michael Jordan was extremely athletic, and Warren Buffett is extremely wealthy. But you can also have moderate exemplars. But if we're exposed to one of these extreme exemplars, then it activates in memory this idea of this person. So if I were to prime you with Albert Einstein, it would activate in memory your idea of Albert Einstein. Now, more than likely, you wouldn't think that your intelligence compares to Albert Einstein. And so instead of assimilating to the prime of Albert Einstein and becoming smarter, or you don't become smarter necessarily, you just consider questions more carefully, you think through things more carefully. So instead of assimilating to that intelligence prime, instead you would engage in social comparison. You would compare yourself to Albert Einstein, which would probably make you think, so if you considered your own intelligence after thinking about Albert Einstein, and comparing yourself to Albert Einstein, you probably think that you are a little bit less intelligent than you might have had you not thought about Albert Einstein. So a contrast effect is when, I guess a fairly simple way of defining it is when your behavior contradicts the implications of the prime. So a contrast priming effect would be me priming you with intelligence and you behaving less intelligently. An assimilation priming effect occurs when I prime you with intelligence and you behave more intelligently. So assimilation, you become more like the prime. Contrast, you become less like the prime. Now, when does assimilation happen? When does contrast happen? Well, assimilation happens when we either have a moderate exemplar, so an instance of a category. When I say category, I mean like a trait category. So you have an instance of a trait category that's moderate, so you could very well be like that person, or just being primed with a general concept. So I prime you with intelligence, or I prime you with athleticism, or I prime you with wealth. Contrast effects typically happen primarily when you're exposed to an extreme exemplar. So you're exposed to an extreme instance of a trait category. So you're exposed to an Albert Einstein, who's an extreme exemplar of intelligence, or Michael Jordan, who's an extreme example of athleticism. Now, again, remember that assimilation, contrast, assimilation effects and contrast effects happen for different reasons. They happen due to different mechanisms. Assimilation happens due to spreading of activation. Contrast happens due to social comparison. All right. Now, over the years, there have been multiple models to try and explain exactly how different primes, so priming various trait categories like intelligence, athleticism, wealth, how these can actually lead to behavior. So how can an intelligence prime lead to a person behaving more intelligently? How can a athleticism prime lead to a person behaving more athletically? Well, one of the very first models was proposed by John Barge, and it was called the perception behavior link. It was based on one of the fathers of experimental psychology's model, the father of psychology. Apparently, I can't speak well today. It is sometimes acknowledged to be William James. Now, William James had come up with something called the idiomotor model. Well, John Barge John Barge's model of primed behavior effects was based on William James's ideomotor model, but he called it the perception behavior link. So according to John Barge's perception behavior link, when we perceive some stimulus in our environment, so when we perceive something in our environment, like the briefcase from earlier, so when we perceive it, it activates our mental representation of that stimulus. So it activates our mental representation of a briefcase. Now, it is associated with your category of competition. Also associated with that category of competition are behaviors that people would engage in when they're competing. So, you see the briefcase, your perception of the briefcase activates this category of competition, and that category of competition includes information about how people behave when competing. Remember that spreading of activation mechanism? That spreading of activation then activates your mental representation of how people behave when competing. And because that information about how people behave when competing is active in memory, you're more likely to behave competitively like you think people behave when competing. So it's really simple. You perceive something that indicates you perceive something, it activates a mental representation of the category, which activates a mental representation of the behavior, perception behavior. There's a link between them, and that increases the chance of your assimilating to the prime. So, you're primed with competition by seeing a briefcase. Your perception of that activates your mental representation of the behavior, and it increases the chances of you behaving or assimilating to the prime, behaving more competitively. So that's the perception behavior link in a nutshell. But that's the first model of primed behavior effects, and there have been many since, because the perception behavior link didn't explain everything. As you might notice, it only explains assimilation effects. The most recent model of primed behavior effects is called the situated inference model, and it was proposed by two fellows by the name of Lorsch and Payne. Actually, I don't know that they're fellows. It doesn't matter. But Lorsch and Payne proposed the situated inference model. The situation inference model argues that all priming effects occur through a series of steps, and there are specifically 3 steps. Step 1. Exposure to the priming stimulus, the briefcase, activates or makes accessible in memory the category related to the stimulus. So the briefcase activates in memory this idea of competition. Next, so step 2. We then attribute this active mental content to some source. So we could attribute it to us. So why am I thinking these competitive thoughts? Oh, because I feel competitive right now. We could attribute it to someone else. Why am I feeling these competitive thoughts? Oh, you're being competitive right now. Or we could attribute it to some other source. That's step 2. So step 1, exposure to the priming stimulus makes the information accessible in memory. Step 2, we then attribute that information to some source, ourselves or somebody else, are likely targets. And then step 3. Step 3 is a little bit complicated because it deals with affordances. Now, what is an affordance? An affordance is basically how the environment allows you to behave. All right, in a nutshell, that's what an affordance is. How does the environment allow you to behave? You can't go swimming in a desert. Well, I guess if you're at an oasis, you could probably do that. So a desert with no oasis doesn't afford swimming. So you can't swim in a oasis-less desert. All right, so an affordance is essentially just how the environment allows you or affords you to behave. So the third step in the situated inference model is how does the environment afford you using this mental content? So we've seen the briefcase. we've seen the briefcase. And in step 1, that makes the information about competition more accessible. Step 2, that accessible information then gets attributed to someone. We decide why we're thinking about this competition, this competitive information. Let's say in the current example, we attribute it to us. So, well, it's because I'm being competitive. And then step 3, what does our environment allow us to do in order to, how does our environment allow us to use this information? It is very possible that our environment doesn't allow us to use this information. And in that case, there will be no priming effects. But if there is a priming, if the environment allows you to behave in a certain way, then you will. So if you're about to sit down to play a game, in which you can compete with others, if you have this competitive information in memory, step 1, you've attributed it to yourself, step 2, and you're about to play a game that allows you to be competitive, step 3, chances are you will assimilate and become more competitive. All right, and that's the situated inference model. And again, that was proposed by Lorship. And that's what I wanted to cover with this video. So what have we talked about? We've talked about what priming is. We've talked about what primed behavior effects are. We've talked about the mechanisms of spreading of activation and social comparison. We've talked about assimilation effects and contrast effects. And we've talked about 2 models of primed behavior effects. The earliest, the perception behavior link, and the latest, the situation inference model. And that is it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, please send them my way. Other than that, take it easy.